In my previous Opeth video, analyzing the title track from Blackwater Park, I characterized their approach to harmony as impressionistic, which is to say, they largely avoid using conventional functional harmony, preferring instead to paint a sort of abstract auditory landscape, with a large variety of non-functional scales and chords that produce general impressions, such as light and dark, tension and release, and upward or downward voice movement. You can use functional harmony concepts to help explain these impressions, but the overall thrust of this song, as well as most others in their discography, is not suited to stable keys or obvious chord functions. But that said, there are actually some Opeth songs which do primarily use conventional functional harmony, such as Harvest from Blackwater Park, Burden from Watershed, as well as several tracks from the album Damnation. These songs are harmonically complex, but their use of clearly defined key centers and chord functions make them sound right at home among the progressive rock and jazz fusion standards that inspired them. However, not every Opeth song fits neatly into one of these two broad categories. In this video, I'll be analyzing Hessian Peel, also from Watershed, whose use of harmony effectively bridges the gap between the impressionistic and the functional. Let's take a listen. The song starts with a brief intro on acoustic guitar, played with a rubato feel, and essentially with no time signature. This whole section is underscored by a pedal point playing in E, and essentially we seem to be in the key of E minor. To be more specific, the section mostly uses the E natural minor scale. However, there are a few notes which deviate from this. In the second phrase, there's a C sharp, a major sixth borrowed from the Dorian mode, even though later on the melody goes back to the E natural minor C natural. The intro also ends on an E major chord, with its major third G sharp borrowed from the E mixolydian mode. These types of borrowing are not uncommon in rock music, and together with the general shape and style of the riffs they appear in, it's tempting to describe them as blues affectations. Now, it would be hard to fully unpack the music theory of the blues here, but a lot of blues techniques boil down to mixing major and minor features into a single musical setting. There are a lot of constraints on how exactly these features can be mixed, and the intro tends to obey these constraints. But as Hessian Peel continues, we'll see that Opeth generalized the idea of mixing or juxtaposing major and minor features beyond the blues and into abstract impressionistic territory, while still staying in touch with the functional harmonic ideas that often accompany the blues. Moving on to the next section, we get two guitar parts, a melody and a repeated rhythmic riff. As with section 1, we're in the key of E minor, and the rhythm part is playing essentially diatonic chords. They are voiced as E sus2 and D sus2, though it's not unreasonable to think of the implied chord functions here as simply being 1 minor and flat 7 major. The melody largely uses an E natural minor scale, though there's one glaring exception. The first two measures are repeated in measures 3 and 4, but the penultimate note, a D, is sharpened to a D sharp, a major 7th. This could be borrowed from the E harmonic minor scale, but strangely it's played over the D sus2 chord, which still maintains the original scale's D natural. This creates a sharp dissonance. You can sort of hear these notes as forming a minor ninth interval, and since there's also an E inside the D sus2 chord, the whole thing acts a bit like a chromatic tone cluster. Clearly this is not a blues type of major-minor mixture, but as section 2 continues, we'll get some more insight about what it actually is. After a few repetitions of this basic 2-chord loop, this section abruptly shifts into a completely different key. There's also now a vocal melody instead of the first guitar, though the second guitar continues to play a similar role as before. It's clear that we're now in the key of C sharp minor. The two chords are a C sharp sus2 and what could either be described as a Lydian A sus chord or simply a B major over A. The entire vocal melody uses a C-sharp natural minor scale, and since everything here is diatonic, it's not unreasonable to consider the chord functions to be either 1 minor and flat 6 major or 1 minor and flat 7 major, the latter pair being the same functions as the chords used in the first part of this section. Even though this modulation from E minor to C-sharp minor seems abrupt, there is a deep relationship between these two keys and the key of E major. Namely, C-sharp minor is E major's relative minor, and E minor is E major's parallel minor. If this sounds too abstract, take a look at the first few phrases of the vocal melody. They use the standard C-sharp pentatonic minor scale, which of course uses the same notes as the E major pentatonic scale. These scales are common in the blues, often adding a chromatic approach note or blue note, here it's the G natural, which acts as a flat fifth in the C-sharp pentatonic minor scale, or more importantly, as a minor third in the E pentatonic major scale. In other words, the blue note is a minor borrowing into a major key. The subtle appearance of this note in the blues-inflected vocal style here, in fact, prolongs the influence of the E minor scale from the first part of this section amidst chords that are essentially in E major. It should now be apparent that the unusual D sharp in this section's first half is the obverse of this concept, a borrowing from E major amidst chords that are essentially in E minor. This influence is strongest in the transition between the two keys, where this sequence of notes among the two lead melodies firmly suggests the key of C-sharp minor, preempting the actual key change by a couple of beats. While this major-minor mixture diverges somewhat from conventional blues techniques, it still has a strong functional underpinning. Despite the changing key, the vast majority of the chords and melody inside each key are diatonic, with fairly clear diatonic chord functions at work. And furthermore, the transition between the keys is softened by diatonic-sounding chord movements. For example, the movement from D major to C-sharp minor would be diatonic in the E Mixolydian mode or the C-sharp Phrygian mode. The suspended voicing of the D and C sharp chords, as opposed to their typical major and minor triads, makes this change sound a little more chromatic, but the root note movement harkens to a more mellow diatonic change. Likewise, the movement from B major over A to E minor would be fairly typical in the E harmonic minor setting. Technically, the harmonic minor scale is not diatonic, but it's a far more common familiar non-diatonic feature than the more involved modulation that actually underpins this section. The emphasis on the B major over A's D sharp also mirrors the non-diatonic D sharp that occurs amidst the E minor melody. As section 2 continues, there are a few small variations in its arrangement. The second journey through C sharp minor features a harmonized oboe melody instead of vocals, and after returning to E minor, the guitar melody is now also harmonized. These additions are also entirely diatonic to their respective keys, mostly harmonizing in thirds, which has a very conventional and familiar sound that tends to emphasize the diatonic quality of the scales being used. From here we reach section 3, which features a much more chromatic sounding chord progression, though as we'll soon see, it draws from the exact same major-minor mixture concept as the first two sections. It starts with a vocal melody against a few keyboard chords, but soon these are joined by acoustic guitar arpeggios, and then the vocal melody is replaced by a violin melody. The chords here are pretty unambiguous, a cycle of F sharp minor, A minor, G sharp minor, and G major. In the key of E minor, these entail chord functions of 2 minor, 4 minor, 3 minor, and flat 3 major. Granted, there may be another way to analyze this progression, but these unique chord functions have another significance I need to talk about first. When I started working out the harmonic analysis for Hessian Peel on paper, I was immediately struck by this chord progression because I had just analyzed another song which uses the exact same chord functions. In fact, I recently put out a video about this song, Airborne by Jaga Jazzist. Its main chord progression is in the B-flat Dorian mode, but if we view it from the equivalent major key, A-flat major, its chords end up using the same 2 minor, 4 minor, 3 minor, flat 3 major pattern. This is not a commonly used progression, and what's more, both songs use the same 6/8 time signature and the same general timing, an equal 2-measure duration for each chord. Could all of this be a coincidence? It's certainly possible, but I have a lurking suspicion that it isn't. To be clear, I'm not accusing Opeth's primary songwriter Mikhail Åkerfeldt of plagiarism. There are a bunch of pretty big differences in how the two songs use these chords, so if anything, I'd be more comfortable describing the situation as a borrowing. But I really have to wonder whether Mikhail heard Airborne sometime after Jaga Jazzist released A Living Room Hush in 2001, and then, perhaps unconsciously, reused these ideas when writing Hessian Peel only a few years later. After all, Mikhail notably enjoys jazz, and both he and Jaga Jazzist are Scandinavian artists. Anyway, if you want to see an alternative interpretation for the chord progression in section 3 of Hessian Peel, I'd recommend checking out my analysis of Airborne. In that track, it makes sense to view all the chords as variations or borrowings in a single key. That perspective is supported by its main melody, whose scale only varies slightly over the course of that progression. In contrast, Hessian Peel uses quite a few significant scale changes. So let's get back to it. Section 2 ended in the key of E minor, and now we have this new chord progression. It clearly has a more chromatic quality, and in fact the root notes of these chords descend by semitones from the A minor back to the starting F sharp minor. Two of these chords still fit into E minor though, namely the A minor and the G major. And wouldn't you know it, the remaining chords, namely F sharp minor and G sharp minor, both fit into the key of C sharp minor, or alternatively its relative major key, E major. As with section 2, these chords are a mixture between parallel minor and major keys. But while section 2 emphasizes these keys' diatonic characteristics, section 3 takes a much more non-functional approach. To begin with, the chords alternate between these keys much more quickly, and also neither key's tonic chord is ever explicitly played. The A minor and G major are the 4 minor and flat 3 major in E minor, and the F sharp minor and G sharp minor are the 4 minor and 5 minor in C sharp minor, or the 2 minor and 3 minor in E major. Without any tonic, the relationship between chords and keys is a little bit more obscure, leading to a somewhat tense, up-in-the-air kind of sound. Meanwhile, the vocal melody deviates even further from these keys. While the F sharp minor and G sharp minor chords seem to relate to C sharp minor, the melody uses each chord's respective natural minor scale, the former using an A natural and the latter an A sharp. And while the A minor and G major chords seem to relate to E minor, the melody uses the A natural minor and G Lydian scales respectively, the former using a C natural and the latter a C sharp. In the next part of this section, a new vocal melody uses these same scale variations. Yet, this melody still connects to the diatonic and blues-oriented sound of the earlier sections. Consider how it relates to the first two chords. Even though the C natural reflects a change to A natural minor, it could also be heard as the blue note in an F sharp minor scale. This interpretation is especially obvious if we prolong the F sharp minor chord underneath both phrases. This melodic phrasing would be absolutely typical of the blues in a single diatonic key. Similarly, over the last two chords, even though the D natural reflects a change to G Lydian, it could also be heard as a blue note in the G sharp blues scale. So even though this section's compositional elements are mostly non-diatonic, its particular use of melody connects them to the blues idiom. And while most of this section's chord changes are explicitly non-diatonic, such as this chromatic mediant change or these semitonal changes, the final chord change from G major to F sharp minor could fit into a diatonic key, namely the F sharp Phrygian mode. This is a pretty small detail, but it does explain why the G Lydian scale is used here, as opposed to the default G major scale, which might have been a suitable parallel to all these other default natural minor scales. And in fact, as we move on to section 4, the diatonic quality of the F sharp minor to G major change becomes all the more apparent. This new section is in the key of B minor, where F sharp minor and G major chords serve as 5 minor and flat 6 major functions. As a result, the transition into this section acts as a flat 6 major to 1 minor change, with a neatly diatonic sound that lends a satisfyingly recognizable quality to this section's harmonizing guitar parts. The harmonized melodic contours are fairly conventional here, especially in measures 3 and 4, where a single shape moves down by diatonic steps until this final figure, at which point it shifts into B harmonic minor in order to outline an F-sharp 7 chord, which betokens a strong 5 dominant 7 to 1 minor change. This section also has a brief outro, which is less diatonic but still very easy to understand in functional terms. It starts with a repeated acoustic guitar and flute motif, and finishes with a few measures of piano. The initial chord progression is pretty straightforward, beginning with a B major chord borrowed from this section's parallel major key. In classical music, this 5-1 resolution to an unexpected major chord, especially at the end of a section, is called a Picardy third or a Picardy cadence. Here, however, it quickly moves back to the normal tonic minor chord. This direct change in chord quality has a kind of disconcerting sound, but it's immediately tempered by several more typical diatonic changes in B minor. On the second repetition, this progression moves directly from the B minor to the B major and back. But since B major has been somewhat established, these changes are only moderately dissonant. The outro's final piano part begins in B minor, but gradually includes a C natural, then a G sharp, and finally a D sharp before landing on an E major chord. These notes shift the scale first to B Phrygian and then to a B Mixolydian with a flattened second. The major quality of this latter scale was established earlier, but now it acts more like a secondary dominant, which pushes towards the scale's 4 chord. Normally in B minor this would be a 4 minor chord, but here it is instead a 4 major chord, another Picardy third in the tonicized key of E major. The next few chords further elaborate on this harmony. The E minor and C major are typical diatonic chords in the B Phrygian context, removing the major quality of the E's Picardy third, but it also makes sense to look at this from the perspective of E minor, a diatonic mode of B Phrygian. From here, the F major sharp 11 is a flat 2 chord, which is in turn borrowed from E Phrygian, repeating the minor to Phrygian shift that the piano melody started with. The final tritone is a bit ambiguous, but in a diatonic key, the tritone often indicates a 5 dominant 7 chord. In E minor, this would be the B7, which certainly contains these notes, but as the piano fades out, an organ fades in, repeatedly hammering away at the tritone's A. This heralds a dramatic shift in the song's style as well as its use of harmony. Up until now, in what we could describe as Hessian Peel Part 1, Opeth have essentially been playing progressive rock. The instrumentation has been somewhat mild, with electric guitars and clean rock vocals balanced with gentle acoustic guitar, flute, violin, and piano. And while the harmony in Part 1 has shown some of Opeth's impressionistic tendencies, there's also been ample use of functional diatonic harmony. But now, going into Hessian Peel Part 2, Opeth are about to lean fully into death metal, with extremely heavy guitar and drums, harsh vocals, and a compositional style that almost completely abandons functional harmony. Section 5 starts with a combined guitar and organ riff. This is clearly in a different harmonic space than the closing chords of section 4. The melodic shape of the guitar part's power chord seems to be taken from the upper part of the C-sharp harmonic minor scale. Since section 4 ended in the key of E minor, this modulation mirrors the one used in section 2. It also allows us to see another commonality between these two keys. We interpreted the last tritonal chord of section 4 as a B7, but its two notes D sharp and A are also present in the G sharp 7 flat 9 chord, a conventional 5 dominant 7 to the 1 minor chord of C sharp minor. You can actually expand this equivalence to 4 different dominant chords spaced apart by minor thirds due to their resemblance to a single diminished 7th chord. You may need to stare at this diagram for a moment before it makes sense, but basically, lowering any one of the diminished chord's 4 notes by a semitone creates a dominant chord. This transformation eliminates one of the diminished chord's 2 tritones, but the other one ends up giving the resulting dominant chord its characteristic tension. B7 and G sharp 7 are drawn from this relationship, and serve as the 5 dominant 7 chords of the E minor and C sharp minor keys respectively. The organ part adds a non-functional twist to this section, however. It plays a series of minor triads based on the root notes of this section's melodic shape. On one hand, the presence of the G sharp minor and C sharp minor chords strengthen the feeling that this section is in C sharp minor, but the A minor and C minor chords are strictly non-functional. This kind of chromatic chord planing is a fairly common technique in death metal and black metal, where its rejection of diatonic structure creates a feeling of profane unease. From here we come to section 6, featuring an intense guitar solo over a heavy guitar riff. We're in yet another new harmonic space. The lower riff uses the B harmonic minor scale, oscillating between the 5 major and flat 6 major chords in this scale, while the guitar solo switches between the B harmonic minor and natural minor scales, particularly in its final scale run where the natural minor has easier fingering. Of course, the key of B minor is familiar from section 4, but the transition into it here is fairly jarring. Section 5's ending C sharp minor could be seen as a pivot chord with a 2-5 diatonic relationship with this opening F sharp 7 at 11, but normally this would push us towards the key of B major, not B minor. So even though section 6 itself is more diatonic, moving into it sounds quite abruptly dark, with the B minor's D natural and G natural being flatter than the D sharp and G sharp of the previous section's C sharp minor key. In addition to re-establishing a familiar key, section 6 also lays the groundwork for the next section's harmony. The first half of section 7 consists of a single guitar riff which largely uses a diminished scale. Before, we saw how diminished 7th chords relate to dominant chords, and applying this relationship to the F sharp 7 chord which defines section 6 gives us a G diminished 7th chord. There are 2 diminished scales which contain this chord, the F sharp half-whole diminished scale, which is used for this riff, and the E half-whole diminished scale, which will be used later on in this section. Either of these scales would move us away from the usual diatonic sound, with lots of additional dark or dissonant intervals such as minor thirds and tritones. But certain regions of these scales would still overlap with part of our former diatonic context. To illustrate, the E half-whole diminished scale overlaps with the A sharp, B, C sharp, D, and E of the B harmonic minor scale, while the F sharp half-whole diminished scale overlaps with the E, F sharp, G, and A of the B natural minor scale. We can see these latter notes in the third measure of this riff, which seems to conjure a shape similar to an E minor 9, the 4 minor chord in B minor. In contrast, the shared notes of the E half-whole diminished scale have a lot more in common with B minor 9, this key's 1 minor chord. So a lot of the impact of initially using the F sharp half-whole diminished scale is tied to the rejection of this tonic B minor, while still holding some resemblance to the previous section's tonality. This initial movement between the A and the B flat really seems to emphasize the absence of the root B, and in fact, as the riff repeats, the B briefly reappears, the single note from this riff which isn't in the F sharp half-whole diminished scale, so as to reenact the drama of rejecting it. But then, the second half of section 7 moves to the G diminished 7th chord's other diminished scale, the E half-whole diminished scale, using another single guitar riff. This modulation by a downward whole step, from F sharp diminished to E diminished, is reminiscent of the key change between sections 5 and 6, and moreover, the scale should be more reminiscent of the familiar tonic B minor context. But now the riff is more clearly rooted in E, as opposed to the more fluid and ambiguous shape of the previous riff. And furthermore, even though the first measure sticks to the E half-whole diminished scale, it also has a strong resemblance to the notes of an E Phrygian dominant scale, with this G natural being one of the more common chromatic passing tones, borrowed from the regular Phrygian scale. As the riff continues, it abandons the diminished scale entirely and starts using this new scale instead. Though not strictly diatonic, this suggests a somewhat more functional context, where this scale serves as the dominant mode of A harmonic minor, yet another downward whole step modulation when you compare this key to the original B minor. There's a small riff tacked on to the end of this section, which consists of a few diminished chords. We start with the familiar G diminished 7th chord, which defined both halves of the foregoing section. But together with the second chord, F sharp diminished 7th, this seems to suggest a return to the F sharp half-whole diminished scale, the only scale to contain both of these chords. The effect of this pivot is fairly subtle though, due to the lack of explicit scale-based playing here. Overall, this section is kind of a whirlwind of changing scales, what one of the commenters on my previous Opeth video referred to as riff stew. No doubt this contributes to this section's intense, precipitous sound, but the effect is heightened by the connections between these scales and the key of the previous section, which these riffs hint at but ultimately reject. Moving on to section 8, we get a little break from the intensity with a return to the song's lighter, progressive rock style. Initially, this section is simply a vocal melody over a minimalistic guitar riff. E is clearly still the root note here, but there's been a dramatic change in the scale. The vocal melody employs what sounds like the Mixolydian mode in measures 1 through 6 and 10 through 13, and what sounds like the Dorian mode in measures 7 through 9. The E half-whole diminished scale had both the G and the G sharp, and now it's like those notes are being split into two different diatonic scales. The guitar further complicates things, however, replacing both these scales F sharps with an F natural. And as the section continues and the vocals drop out, we get two guitar parts and a violin melody that use an entirely different selection of scales. The E half-whole diminished scale plays a significant role in both guitar parts. However, the first guitar periodically abandons it in favor of a simple minor pentatonic phrase, and the second guitar adds a subtle minor sixth, C natural, in order to arpeggiate an F minor 9 chord. Nonetheless, this chord largely serves to emphasize the F, G, A-flat note sequence that is so characteristic of this underlying diminished scale. And then, finally, there are the violin parts, which use the E Phrygian dominant scale that appeared at the end of section 7. All of the section's numerous scale variations are played simultaneously, though careful arrangement mitigates a lot of the dissonance. For example, in the second measure, the second guitar's A-flat and the first guitar's A-natural are staggered so they don't overlap. At one point, the violin melody plays an A-natural over the guitar's A-flat, but there's enough separation in timbre and in range to disguise the clashing harmony. Still, polytonality is a pretty unusual technique. Why does it work so well here? I think it has a resemblance to some of the blues techniques I outlined earlier in the song. Initially, Hessian referenced the blues idiom through the use of blue notes and modulation between parallel major and minor keys. But now it is generalizing this concept to a new set of scales: the diminished scale, the Phrygian dominant scale, and a couple of diatonic modes. In section 7, I pointed out how certain regions of the diminished scale can overlap with diatonic scales, and we can use a similar concept here to see how all these scales connect. The E half-whole diminished scale, E Phrygian dominant scale, and E Mixolydian mode all share the notes of an E7 chord, namely E, G sharp, B, and D. Additionally, the former two scales share an F and the latter two an A. Finally, the E Mixolydian and E Dorian modes share all of their notes except their third, a G natural in the E Dorian, which connects back to the G natural found in the E half-whole diminished scale. Opeth exploit these commonalities in order to design melodies that are aesthetically similar despite using different scales, making them surprisingly compatible when played simultaneously. You can think of the result kind of like a more elaborate death metal version of blues harmony, which relies on the simpler relationship between major and minor keys. Section 8 concludes with a small riff that's reminiscent of the tritones which appear at the end of Section 7. Here, instead of two tritones separated by a semitone, the guitars play a whole sequence of tritones, descending chromatically, while the vocal melody inserts another downward chromatic line which renders each tritone as a diminished chord. These chords start on the D and end on the F sharp before repeating, and then in the final two measures we get a repeated tritone rooted in G. This final half-step movement from F sharp to G recalls Section 7 even more explicitly, both in terms of rhythm and in its use of the F sharp half-whole diminished scale following a riff that had used the E half-whole diminished scale. Overall, this little digression doesn't have much of a functional component, merely serving to reiterate this tritone-based theme which is fairly typical of death metal harmony. And then we return to the previous riff sequence from Section 8 before finally moving on to Section 9. This section consists of two guitar parts, although the second guitar part is left out during the first 8 measures. The composition here is fiendishly complex, using an atonal technique which is based more on melodic shape than harmony per se. Unfortunately, this makes some of the note spellings a bit awkward. Anyway, let's take a listen. The first guitar has a repeated structure, moving the same fingering up and down the neck. It consists of a root note, its tritone, its octave, and then a minor second above the octave. The root note of this shape moves through a cycle of C sharp, B sharp, F, and D sharp, and the upper notes move in tandem. However, the guitar also performs a few pull-offs to open strings, namely G and B, which remain constant. The end result is a tumult of angular scales that sometimes even include half-step clusters, such as the B, C, and C sharp here, and the F, G flat, and G here. The second guitar adds even more notes. Its riff alternates between these higher octave doubled notes and a low open E string. One thing you might notice about the higher notes is how their movement through F sharp, E, and D sharp has a similar shape to the root notes of the first guitar, forming major sixth intervals underneath its D sharp, C sharp, and B sharp. Following this pattern, we might expect the second guitar to play an A flat in this third chord underneath the first guitar's F, but instead it plays an A sharp. To make sense of everything, it helps to fit all the notes in each of these patterns to a scale, and it turns out that they roughly fit the framework of half-whole diminished scales. You might have expected this, since the first guitar shape uses intervals from the diminished scale, including the major sixth intervals that separate it from the second guitar, but it also turns out that most of the additional open string notes are compatible with these scales as well. There are a few exception notes, namely the B in pattern 2, the G flat in pattern 3, and the B in pattern 4, but the overall pattern is still remarkably consistent, and it matches our choice of diminished scales from sections 7 and 8. The exception note in pattern 3 may also explain why the second guitar plays an A sharp instead of an A flat. An A flat would have resulted in a huge half-step cluster using E, F, G flat, G, and A flat. Using the A sharp instead maintains a more consistent amount of dissonance throughout the section. But more importantly, the A sharp also serves as an equivalent root note for the E half-whole diminished scale, similar to how D sharp is an equivalent root note for the F sharp half-whole diminished scale. In contrast, an A flat half-whole diminished scale equates to the third unused variety, so it might have seemed out of place in the second guitar's lower register. Overall, this is clearly the most dissonant and least functional part of Hessian Peel. Yet unlike the other heavy sections of this song, its core concept seems to take a more abstract pattern-based approach rather than an impressionistic one. However, because these chromatically plain patterns are cleverly chosen to inhabit our familiar alternating diminished scales, with only a few exception notes, this section's aesthetic impression is still fairly consistent with the rest of the song. There is one final riff that is tacked on to the end of section 9 as a conclusion to the song, with two guitar parts combining to form a series of chords. The first of these chords are F minor and E minor, followed by F sus4 and E5. This is clearly related to the chords from section 8, which use the E half-whole diminished scale. Again, the C natural diverges from this scale, but it makes sense to include it here so that stable chords can be formed against the root note of F. It's also interesting to see how these chords evolve from the previous part of this section. The last scale in use there, the F-sharp half-whole diminished scale, could also be thought of as forming a complex F-sharp minor environment, especially because its exception note B replaces that scale's typical B-flat, which is equivalent to a major third. So the transition from that scale to F minor reads sort of like a downward chromatic step, which is repeated to reach the E minor. This is kind of reminiscent of the long chromatic descent riff that's tacked on to the end of section 8. These chromatic movements are capped off by a series of chromatic minor thirds, starting up at A-flat and ending down at E. The starting and ending points, of course, both belong to the E half-whole diminished scale as well. And just like that, Hessian peal ends. There's far too much content in this song for me to even summarize here at the end, so I'll just reiterate the main point of this analysis, namely that Opeth are able to blend conventional functional harmony with their trademark style of impressionistic harmony. This blending is reminiscent of the blues style, alluded to in the beginning of this song, but adapted to the more varied and dissonant harmonic features of death metal. And while the result of this technique is complicated, it can still be teased apart into coherent patterns if you have the patience. This concludes my analysis of Hessian peal. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.